Alright, so this will be hopefully a quick guide on how to get going with Beast. First thing to mention is the variety of wave shapes that you have available to you. So that's a full range of classic analog style wave shapes, and you have all the values in between that are sort of a mix of the nearest two wave shapes. If you want the exact values for the exact wave shapes, it's in the manual, or otherwise just use the oscilloscope. One interesting thing worth mentioning is how the saw wave in Beast is an actual saw wave, whereas on the Minilogue here, the saw indicator is actually, it's not a saw technically, it's a ramp waveform. I'll show you that now. See how it goes up like a ramp? And with Beast, the saw waveform is a saw. And this is worth mentioning because there's an old trick with old synths where if you have one oscillator with a saw and the other one with a ramp, it doesn't really matter which is which, they combine to create a sort of almost like a pulse or a pseudo pulse width modulation square shape. So if I bring in the ramp waveform of the analog oscillator here, and then the actual saw from Beast, they're pretty in sync with each other. So if I detune it, you see you get this sort of almost like pseudo pulse width modulation, as I mentioned. Just worth noting that. So one of the main things with Beast is the ability for the oscillator to just be maximal at all times, and that includes being able to gain it even louder than the existing oscillators. So if you look at, again with the saw / ramp waveform, that's as loud as it gets, as high as it goes. Whereas with the saw variant here on Beast, it's quite a bit fuller and can be gained even louder. So that helps push the mixer, and I'll go into that a little bit more in a second. What that does is it produces even more analog saturation in the actual analog synth than is otherwise normally possible, because the gain staging of the oscillators is kind of gentle, but this allows you to actually push the mixer and filter and get that ideal analog saturation out of it. So another part of this maximal design of Beast is the way the sub-oscillator is used internally with Beast. So the way that this works is that when the sub-oscillator goes in minus values, it makes the sub-oscillator an octave lower than the main oscillator. And in positive values, it makes the sub-oscillator the same octave as the main oscillator. So also, well, I'll show you how it sounds. So we're going to go an octave lower. And that between -1 and -50 or -49, it's a sine waveform that the sub-oscillator is producing. And then it makes a abrupt switch to a square wave at -50 to -99. And then you hear the saw underneath coming back, being louder in relation to the square. And then at -100 is effectively 0. So this creates almost like a triangular sort of amplitude of the sub-oscillator. That I have this little graphic here I'll post that hopefully makes it make more sense, but should be pretty intuitive. All right, then in positive values, as I was saying, the sub-oscillator is actually the same octave as the main oscillator in Beast. And this is kind of a unique feature. It's not very often. I'm not sure if you'll ever find that in a analog system. And the reason for is because it's just really easy to create unwanted phase cancellations whenever two waveforms occupy the same octave. What I've done here with Beast, though, is I've implemented an automatic phase optimization, so that no matter the mix of the sub-oscillator to the main oscillator, there's always an optimal phase relationship between the two, and to create the most maximal and full waveform. So again, I'm adding a sine sub-oscillator to the saw, the main oscillator that we've set, and then square. just the saw. Basically, the sub oscillator is 0 to 100. Similar triangular sort of, or the exact same triangular sort of amplitude situation as with an octave lower in the sub oscillator. So just to show you with the different wave shapes here and the sub oscillator. So if I set it to, a sine wave at the same octave range as the main oscillator, you get this sort of, it appears to be a decreasing volume relationship of the main oscillator to the sub oscillator. That's because the waveform is always gain compensated to be at maximal volume. So that's why it sounds like that, and that actually helps you dial in the optimal sub oscillator value. But you can now, I'll turn to the exciter to show how you can actually add some of the high harmonics back and sort of achieve this mid-scoop sort of effect that is also kind of a common sound of analog systems with the exciter. So it's already got some in there to kind of give a little bit of that buzziness back. I got a pretty, as I like to put it, thick and buzzy rather than, thin and honky sort of sound. And again, comparing it to the stock saw. That's the stock saw, and this is with our sub oscillator enhanced saw. Quite a big difference. And to show this phase optimization really quickly, I'll set this to fairly substantial amount of sine sub oscillator, and then go through the different wave shapes. Always remain at an optimal phase sort of relationship between the sub and the main oscillator. Another interesting thing with the exciter is you can do this kind of almost like a pseudo neuro-y kind of effect with, engaging it sort of higher than you normally probably would. So the underlying main oscillator is a high frequency shape. So you could use a saw or a square or some similar type high frequency sound. And then essentially by engaging the exciter, we're gaining those high frequencies in relation to the sub oscillator. And so when sweeping, and so if you don't want to use the exciter, but you still want to add some harmonic and high frequencies, you can use a saturator instead, which also can really sort of fill up the signal and make it even beefier. So probably one of the main uses of Beast will be as a sort of optimal fundamental tone in your patch. In other words, the lowest octave oscillator in your patch, just to sort of provide that extra oomph to your sound. So with phase optimization, it also gives the sub oscillator a sort of the ability to get a sweet spot with the sub oscillator. Normally what you do is you'd set an oscillator to just a raw wave shape as either saw, sine, or tri, or square, but then you have to sort of deal with the trade-offs. Saw might be a little thin, might have some high frequencies. Maybe sine is the thickest or the most solid low end, but there's no high frequencies. You lose character. And square has maybe too many frequencies and it needs to be toned down. So with combining the sub oscillator with the main oscillator, you can essentially easily find a sweet spot. Saw sine, tri square, square sine, and anything in between to create that perfect fundamental. So to show how much the Beast can help really push the mixer and get that nice analog saturation that you otherwise can't get, I'll do a pretty typical patch here on the using the analog oscillators. Set the first two to just a simple beating saw wave. And for the fundamental, we'll put a we'll make a square shape. Something like that seems about optimal. So we have the fundamental. I mean, we have the two beating oscillators an octave higher, and then I'll bring in the beast as the fundamental. And by combining all of these sort of maximal signal options available to you, you can see how you can push the saturation and analog character of these logue synths to their limits. So another sort of magical thing with vintage systems is how they're not actually, perfectly locked with their, phase and pitch, and they have a little bit of variation in everything they do, and kind of adds to that sweetness. So you have these parameters available to you in Beast that can allow you to really open up variation, subtle and extreme. It's up to you, but even in subtle variation, it can have a pretty big impact on the overall sound. So first I'll mention how to use pitch warble. So for that, what I'll do is I'll bring the oscillators in relative sync with each other. They are right there as it is. So, and then I'll add a little bit of pitch warble, which has like a sort of a non-linear, semi-random variation to the pitch. So even subtle amounts, it already is varying the pitch in an interesting way. And now if I detune them, the pitch warble has just a little bit of that variable character that, again, you might find in a vintage system versus completely pitch locked. And I find that if you even add quite a bit of this to short plucked sound like arpeggios, it can really thicken the sound. With phase warble, it's kind of similar. It sounds very similar to pitch variation, but for phase warble, it's actually a more cyclical, more like an LFO, but actually also varies the phase over time, and it creates an interesting detune effect and sort of can add a lot more fatness to your detune patches. So again, make them relatively in sync with each other, the analog oscillator and beast. Pretty in sync there. Now I'll add phase warble. And you can find these sweet spot detune values that sort of give you this nice fat detune effect. But another thing about phase warble that's interesting is that it can also produce internal detune with the sub-oscillator. So if you have the sub-oscillators normally in sync with the main oscillator to prevent that bad phase cancellation issue, that thinness that I was talking about earlier. But so if I set the sub-oscillator, let's say to a square, somewhat lower volume, you can hear that they're now detuned. You can hear that now the sub-oscillator and main oscillator of Beast, they detune with each other and they're no longer phase locked. So to show you that, that's with phase warble on and phase unlocked, and that's with the phase locked. It's worth noting also with these parameters, the pitch warble and phase warble, that both the rate and depth are affected by the parameter. And for the final parameter, we have an internal LFO that's routed to automatically affect the shape. the most iconic version of this on analog systems would be pulse width modulation. So you can set to a square. Really quickly you can get some pulse width modulation going. And it's worth mentioning that the internal LFO for this is unipolar, so wherever the shape knob is set, that represents the lowest value in the oscillation. Now you can combine the hardware LFO and the internal LFO to create sort of very wild and unpredictable modulations, but with the hardware LFO, it's implemented as a bipolar, so basically wherever the shape is set to, it represents the midpoint value of that oscillation cycle. And of course, you're not limited to just pulse width modulation. Any other wave shape can be modulated between. So that's about all that I want to cover in this guide. I just want to leave you with a few quick tips that worth keeping in mind to sort of maximize your usage of Beast and your Logue synthesizer. If you're going to be creating an init patch with Beast, I recommend using the init patch included in the presets that come with Beast. And the reason for that is because there's a bit of a quirk with the Logue SDK where when you have bipolar values, such as in the case of the exciter/saturator and the sub-oscillator, when you initialize Beast, it initializes those parameters to the lowest possible values, which are -100 in both cases, which is not optimal, especially in the case of the exciter. And the sub-oscillator doesn't quite matter so much because the sub-oscillator -100 is effectively 0, but a -100 exciter is definitely not optimal. So the init patch there would have everything set up to roughly represent the defaults that were intended with Beast. So a big tip is to not be afraid to really gain the signal throughout the chain in the synth. Obviously in the mixer, before it goes into the filter, that's a big one because it really drives the filter signal. And it really gives the filter something hefty to bite onto. But you can also gain it at the output stage by making the level as loud as possible. That's what I like to do. Why not? I mean, take advantage of it. So you can find the level control here to digitally increase the level. Of course, on output master, why not gain that as well before it goes into your interface? And another recommendation is to maybe use the LFO to create sort of a subtle and slow cyclical pitch variation, and then within that cyclical pitch variation, add a little bit of that pitch warble and create a little bit more of a sort of controlled, more authentic sounding to how vintage systems might sound with regards to the pitch variation. And for the Minilogue here, there's actually kind of a hidden feature here, hidden because it may be missed by a lot of people, in the chorus, where if you select vibrato, if you hit shift and select, get to vibrato, you actually get a sort of a dual benefit here. You get a louder gained signal, essentially. It doubles up the signal. And you get also a little bit of that pitch variation, which you can use in lieu of the LFO or together with it. Alright, so that's about all I want to say about Beast right now. Just a very simple overview, and there's a lot more you can dive into, but that's just the basics. So, hope you enjoy Beast, and thanks for checking this out.